Fuel filter can cause poor starting, low power, and white exhaust smoke. The change interval for the filter is 12 months or 12,000 miles. To replace the filter, disconnect the water and fuel sensor connector and unscrew the separator from the fitting on the bottom of the fuel heater. Make sure that the fuel heater assembly doesn't move and the water and fuel connector doesn't get jammed behind the filter. It's a good idea to replace the square-cut O-ring on the bottom of the fuel heater with a new O-ring at this point, so you won't forget about it later. Drain the filter into a suitable container and inspect it for contaminants. After disposing of the fuel properly, remove the water and fuel sensor and drain valve from the filter. Inspect the sensor and drain valve for damage. Pay particular attention to the water and fuel sensor probes. If the probes are corroded or damaged, you'll need to clean them or replace the sensor. If the sensor is okay, replace the sensor seal with a new one. After installing the water and fuel sensor and drain on the new filter, fill the assembly with fuel. This will help you avoid manual bleeding of the fuel system. Then apply a light film of clean engine oil to the filter seal. During installation, tighten the filter an additional 1/2 turn after it makes contact with the filter head. Once again, take care not to jam the connector against the engine. A clogged or restricted air filter can cause low power, excessive fuel consumption, and black exhaust smoke. The Cummins turbo diesel engine's air filter element and coolant should be replaced every 24 months or 24,000 miles. Of course, the air filter element should be checked more often than this, as should the coolant level and cooling system condition. Use the owner's manual as a guide to these and other routine checks. Some of the maintenance items on the Cummins diesel are different from those found on most gasoline engines. One of these is valve adjustment. Valves should be adjusted every 24,000 miles or 24 months. Incorrect valve adjustment can cause hard starting, low power, or rough running. To adjust the valves, you first need to locate top dead center. To do this, insert a barring tool, such as snap-on number SP371, in the flywheel housing opening, and use it to rotate the engine. Make sure the ignition is off while doing so, or the engine may start. While rotating the engine, lightly press against the timing pin on the gear housing. The pin will engage a hole in the camshaft gear when the engine is at top dead center on the compression stroke for cylinder number 1. To avoid breaking the pin, disengage it after locating top dead center. At this point, provided the engine is cold, you can adjust number 1 intake and exhaust, number 2 intake, number 3 exhaust, number 4 intake, and number 5 exhaust. Intake valves are adjusted to 0.010 of an inch, and exhaust valves are adjusted to 0.20 of an inch. Be sure to tighten the lock nuts to 18 foot-pounds after making the adjustments. At this point, mark the crankshaft pulley and a corresponding stationary location and rotate the crankshaft 360 degrees. Now you can adjust the remaining valves. That is, the number 2 exhaust, number 3 intake, number 4 exhaust, number 5 intake, and number 6 intake and exhaust. Correct injection pump timing is critical to proper diesel engine operation. Incorrect pump timing can cause poor performance and excessive smoke. Checking the pump timing is required maintenance on California trucks. To check pump timing, first, position the engine at top dead center of the compression stroke for the number 1 cylinder, as described earlier for the valve adjustment. Next, you may need to remove 1 or more high-pressure fuel lines. At this point, remove the plug from the back of the fuel injection pump and obtain a suitable dial gauge and gauge holder to install in the opening. The gauge travel must be at least 2 millimeters. With the dial gauge in place, rotate the engine opposite the normal direction of rotation until the needle on the dial gauge stops. That's counterclockwise as viewed from the front of the engine. Then adjust the gauge to 0. This is the point from which you'll measure plunger lift. Now rotate the engine in the normal direction back to top dead center of the number 1 compression stroke using the timing pin as a guide. Keep track of the number of dial gauge revolutions as you do so. At top dead center of the number 1 cylinder, the amount of travel on the dial gauge is the amount of pump lift. Compare this amount to the amount on the engine ID plate located on the gear housing. If the reading is incorrect, you'll need to loosen the nuts on the pump mounting studs and rotate the pump until the reading is correct. If high pressure lines were removed for the procedure, you'll need to reconnect and bleed them as described earlier. Idle speed is another adjustment that is required on California trucks. Idle speed that is low can cause stalling, rough idling, or surging. To adjust idle, loosen the lock nut on the adjusting screw and turn the screw to obtain the proper RPM. Keep in mind that the 700 RPM spec for trucks with automatic transmissions is with the transmission in drive and the air conditioning on. Trucks with manual transmissions have a spec of 750 RPM with the transmission in neutral and the air conditioning on. The idle speed adjustment isn't the only one that affects the engine's RPM range. The throttle linkage adjustment is not required maintenance. However, linkage that is out of adjustment can result in an engine that fails to develop full power. To check the throttle linkage, first, disconnect the throttle cable from the ball stud on the throttle cam. Then insert a 20/1000 inch feeler gauge between the throttle cam and cam stop. At this point, if the linkage is in adjustment, the pump throttle lever should be contacting the low idle speed stop screw, and the spring load breakover lever should have moved off its stop into contact with the breakover spring. If this is not the case, loosen the lock nuts on the throttle rod. Keep in mind that one lock nut has a left-hand thread. Then adjust the rod length until the throttle lever contacts the idle stop screw, and the breakover lever moves off its stop into contact with the breakover spring. After tightening the lock nuts, removing the feeler gauge, and reconnecting the throttle linkage, use the accelerator pedal to check for proper breakover lever positions at idle and full throttle. Next, check the low idle stop speed as described earlier, as well as the full throttle stop speed with the transmission in neutral. The full throttle stop speed should be between 2,825 and 2,925 RPM.